the first opening movement of Just Constellations only uses 5 different pitches.
Oh, yes. Are they septimal harmony?
Yeah, 1, 3, 7, 9, and 21.
Oh, just like in a stack.
Well, they vary because sometimes even seven's on the bottom.
Okay.
So it's not just a stack, but there's only those seven, there's only those five pitches. So it's really interesting how you can do a lot with so little. And in my case, I didn't even focus on rhythm, right? I just focused it on the colors of the harmonies and on the beauty of the resonance.
Yes. I've noticed you like to create so much material from like a small thing, like in I was listening to Revelations just now actually, again of course, how you take like a small idea that's sort of like a seed and then it kind of grows. And then that's sort of the beginning theme and things like that.
Exactly. I do that in most of my big pieces. And part of that is about setting up the listener for an extended experience,
Yeah.
right? So if you start with a slow, gradual opening, it gives people a chance to kind of settle in and breathe and slow down their metabolism. And it kind of sets the listener up for an extended piece.
So you're a composer that uses just intonation. Were you influenced to do that through Indian classical music, Terry Riley? I know that these kinds of influences both have to do with just intonation, but I don't know where like you started with that specifically. Like, how did your journey reveal to you I should be using just intonation?
Right. That's really the important question. So,
Yeah.
because we all come to it through different ways, and of course, it's a universal phenomenon.
Hmm.
So, for me, I was very interested in uh, music as a spiritual path. And so I first started studying mysticism of sound through some Sufi teachers. And then I heard about Pandit Pramath, who's a master Indian musician who is also LaMonte Young and Terry Riley's Indian music guru. So I started studying with him and his disciples, including LaMonte Young and Terry Riley. And after a year, before I was studying with LaMonte and Terry, the first year, uh, after a year of singing every day with the tambora, a tambora is a really rich, resonant drone instrument with lots of harmonics.
Hmm.
The piano started sounding out of tune to me, and piano was my main instrument. So I had the piano
Ah.
tuner come and tune it, and it still sounded out of tune. So then I started studying the physics of sound, and I realized that I was hearing the temperament because just singing long tones with the ragas every day with the drone really fine tuned my hearing. And so then I got a second used piano and just started tuning it myself by ear. So that was the beginning of my exploration. Then the next stage was when I met LaMonte Young and I started studying with LaMonte. It ended up needed somebody to do his tunings for his piece, The Well-Tuned Piano. And so I auditioned and he really liked the way I was tuning, even though I was self-taught. And so I got to come to New York and work with LaMonte periodically through the 1980s and 1990s. And that was a real eye opener because on my own experiments in just intonation, when if you're used to your whole life playing an equal temperament, and then you switch to just intonation, is extremely limiting, right? Because you can't play the same kind of harmonic relationships that you're used to.
Right.
And you can play modal relationships and ragas and things like that. But harmony is the hallmark of Western music. And so without having a highly developed harmonic language, the music can feel kind of limiting.
Hmm.
And so it was my work with LaMonte that really opened up the doors to me to understand how to work with a broader harmonic vocabulary in just intonation, and also how to expand into seven limit tuning, etc. So I would say that my two main resources for getting into just intonation and composition in just intonation are Indian classical music and the music of LaMonte Young.
It seems like you you definitely must have learned a lot about composition, and maybe just other things as well about life from his tutelage.
I really did. Yeah, we were very close for many years, and every time he touched the piano, I sat next to him, basically. Uh, so I was able to learn. He wanted to teach me in a similar way that he had learned Indian classical music with Pandit Pranath, which is through not so much through intellectual study, but through observing. So I never brought, actually later I did bring him some of my music and looked at it and gave me feedback, but in the primary years I was working with him, I was pretty much just observing how he was living his life and doing his music. And it was a really great way to learn, and it's a really different approach than how we normally learn in the West.
Yeah. So kind of like learning by doing, kind of like kinesthetic, or learning by taking in information, auditory and visual.
Exactly. A perfect example of this is how a child learns a language, right? They don't study a book. They just learn from listening and having conversations with their family.
Right. Yeah.
So that's how Indian classical musicians also learn, right? They grow up in a family, usually a family of musicians. They're trained by their father, or in some cases their mother, and they learn and develop that way. So
Yeah.
it was a very similar approach that I did with LaMonte Young. And his piece, The Well-Tuned Piano, which ultimately became 6 hours and 24 minutes in its longest incarnation, was something that I learned in the same way. So I just, every time he was composing, and composing meant for him sitting at the piano and playing through ideas and improvising and kind of working out his ideas at the piano. It didn't mean notating. But so I was just observing that. Plus, I sat next to him throughout all the concerts, and there was about 50 or 60 full-length concerts and recording sessions that I sat through. So I learned the piece that way, and then he asked me to notate the primary themes and chordal areas. So I did that, and I'm really glad that we did, because it's now been many years since those years with LaMonte. And so I still go back and look at those scores from time to time and get ideas.
Yeah. So what are the directions in the score like for the well-tuned piano? Is it like, are there actual notated times? Is it quasi-improvisational? Is it entirely improvisational with some guidelines? Like, how does it work?
Think of it like an Homeric poem, this really long poem that has evolved over time, that originally was not written down, but was part of an oral tradition. It's kind of like that. So, yeah, it's never, the scores, pretty much, the primary scores are the ones that I wrote down, and they were never written to perform the piece from. They were just for reference. Although we did do what we called time scores. So for every performance of the Well-Tuned Piano, which was always on a Sunday, then the following Wednesday we would have a tape playback and listen, and I would sit there with a clock and write down all the times and themes as he was going through.
Ah.
And if you get the Gramavision recording from 1981, actually, and also the 1986 recording, there's a time score for each of those. So you'll see, I don't remember how many exactly, but there's somewhere around 100 different chordal areas and themes that are, then there's also larger groups. So there's like approximately 7 main sections, and then each of those has many different subsections.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a general sequence that you go through when playing the piece, that you go from this macro section with all its little subsections to this next macro section. There's a sequence of modulations. So there's really a lot of material, but the material, some of it is kind of set, but a lot of it is structured improvisation, but it's definitive material at the same time. So it's a really interesting form and process.
Yeah. Would you say that same interest in process has kind of like guided your interest towards Indian classical music as well?
Well, they're parallel for me. But the difference is that I practice Indian classical music between 1 and 3 hours every day. So it's been a big part of my life for 43 years. And the well-tuned piano was something that I worked on intensively over a period of about 7 years. So the well-tuned piano is more like a chapter in my life, and Indian classical music is an ongoing part of my life. But they're similar in that aspect, in that they're, for the most part, non-notated, although I have sketches of both of them, and that they're both based on structured improvisation, having a set of melodic archetypes and ideas and concepts that one can spontaneously get into and explore the musical and spiritual relationships. But there are big differences between Indian music and the well-tuned piano. Like Indian classical music, for the most part, does not modulate. It's always in one key. And the well-tuned piano has a series of modulations, and that are really key structurally to the piece, because he modulates through the seventh harmonic. And so, like, there's a whole section of the piece that is in, let's say, 64, which would be, it's actually kind of a high pitched D, but he calls it E flat because it's on the E flat key on the piano tuned way down. And then what happens is he modulates into the key of 63. So you have this, really complex harmonic relationships and modulations that happen in the piece that are structurally have a lot of importance to the work. And also the well-tuned piano, being a Western piece of music, has a lot of harmonic relationships too, in a way that you don't get in Indian classical music, which is primarily about melody and rhythm.
So the D that's modulated to that is like the E flat key that's tuned way down. Is that a 64 over 63 above the D that's below it?
All right, so the fundamental for the well-tuned piano, LaMonte calls a very low E flat, but it's actually much closer to the pitch of D. It's just on the E flat key on the piano.
Right.
So then if you go up a seventh harmonic, you get, it's tuned on the key pitch C on the piano.
Yeah.
And if you go up a fifth from that, it's tuned to G.
Yes.
And then if you go up a fifth from that, it's tuned to D.
Yes. Okay, so
E flat to D gives you a 64-63 relationship.
Yes.
Right, with the E flat being 64 and the D being 63. So LaMonte begins the well-tuned piano in the key, what he calls the key of E flat, which is really the key of D, just slightly higher.
Mm-hmm.
And then he modulates at one point into the key of D and also into the key of G and C. So then there's all these, the whole middle sections that are in those keys. And then he comes back to the E flat. And then at the very end, he juxtaposes them one right after the other.
Okay. Gotcha.
So that's part of what's going on long-term structural in the well-tuned piano.
Yeah. That's really
And then you get lots of, you also, in the key of D, you have a whole series of septimal relationships with that as well. So for example, the pitch C sharp is tuned to the seventh harmonic above D. And the pitch B natural is tuned to the seventh harmonic above C. So for example, if you go from E flat up a seventh harmonic to C, and then from C up a seventh harmonic to B, the relationship between that E flat and B is 49. It's 7 times 7, so it's 49 over 32.
Yes.
And then you get another type of comma, which would be between that B natural and the B flat, which would be 49, 48.
Oh, yes. So you're getting lots of commas just within 12 notes. I guess the way I read
Lots of
into
commas
it,
within 12 notes, that's correct.
yeah, 64 over 63 and 49 over 48. Both commas that I
In
see.
multiple locations, right?
Yeah.
Not just in those like there's at least three places. I'd have to take a look at the tuning again to see.
I love how these simple patterns will arise from just intonation. Like I know a lot of composers who think that commas are just like a lot to deal with, and they don't want to think about how that works in just intonation. But I feel like that's a great tool for composition when you know what to do with them.
I agree with you completely. In fact, I have a theory about that, which is that, through the common practice period, 1600 to 1900, in Western music, there were a series of rules that people either mostly followed, and then gradually started breaking the rules. And so Schoenberg created the 12-tone system as a way of freeing music from those rules, right? Which were the rules of tonality. So he called it the emancipation of dissonance. Right? He emancipated dissonance from the rules by which dissonance had been governed throughout the history of music. Well, if you think about it, why did temperament come into existence to begin with? It was because in the context of pure simple intervals like pure fifths and pure thirds, when you got the wolf tone, like if you went around a Pythagorean circle and you had the fifth that was going to be really wide and it was going to sound really out of tune, well, they called it the wolf tone because it sounded like the howling of wolves in its dissonance compared with the pure fifths. So it was unacceptable to the musicians at the time. So what did they do? They obliterated it through temperament. So they basically chopped the comma into 12 equal parts, the Pythagorean comma, so that it's still there, but you don't really recognize it or hear it.
Right.
But then what it does is it compromises all the other musical intervals, right? Mm-hmm. Well, if you accept the sound of the comma and the dissonance of the comma and incorporate it into the fabric of your music, then you're not reliant on temperament. Mm-hmm. So the theory is extending Schoenberg's theory of the emancipation of dissonance to the emancipation of the comma.
Yes.
And that then frees you up to explore any types of relationships in just intonation without being dependent on temperament. And it's very interesting when you actually start listening to the commas and when you incorporate the commas harmonically into different modes and harmonies. So, for example, if you're in the key of C, mm-hmm. and then you have the B flat tuned to the 7/4 above C, so it's tuned to the 7th harmonic of C.
Yeah.
And then you also have the E that's tuned as a perfect fourth above C.
E?
And then you have, not E, excuse me, F.
Oh,
F.
okay. Yeah.
Then you take another perfect fourth above the F, and you get a different B flat, which is 16 to 9.
Ah, yes.
Now, if you play those four different pitches together, they all harmonically relate to each other. But the two B flats will be a comma apart, 64 to 63 comma apart. But what's going to happen is they'll all, and let's say you add a G in there so that you have a nice fifth drone, right? So now you have a 4-note chord or mode. Well, those commas on the B flat are actually going to sound really cool. They're going to shimmer and pulsate and create their own rhythms, but each of those B flats relates to the other notes, especially to the C. And so you're harmonically integrating the comma into your chord or mode. And you could do the same thing if you tune then a fifth below both versions of the B flat. So you have a 7 to 6 E flat, and you'd also have a 32-27 E flat. Now you have a minor pentatonic scale, C, E flat, a different E flat, F, G, B flat, and a different B flat. So what you've done is you've taken one of the oldest, most simplest modes in the world, a minor pentatonic scale, and you've created a contemporary version where you have two versions of the third degree and two versions of the seventh degree. Everything's harmonically interrelated, but now it's shimmering and pulsating in a way that if you didn't have those different versions of the comma, it wouldn't. And it's a really amazing sound, and it's almost like when you start incorporating those commas in, that you're clicking on a phase shift pedal that creates this chorus effect, but actually it sounds even better. So when you start using commas, there's all sorts of interesting things that you can explore in music that you couldn't explore through the 300 years plus that we obliterated and avoided them.
Right. I think I'm sort of hearing this strategy you're talking about of incorporating commas in Revelations, where there are several like runs in the piano where the run almost seems either diatonic or from a simple seven limit harmony, but then you've got two notes that are really, really close to each other. The comma, that's a very hearable sound, I think, in lots of like melodic microtonal piano music. I really like the idea of combining things a comma apart vertically in the same chord and having that, have a concordant sound, because I don't think that's a very normal strategy. Is that something you're using in any of your music as a sonority, or are you mostly approaching the comma in like arpeggios and scalar runs and things like that?
I do mostly the second, but I do some of the first. So sometimes there's harmonic juxtapositions, a comma apart. Or for example, you'll hear like in certain places, like in the opening section, where you'll hear something placed with one note, and then you'll hear the same phrase with the note a comma apart, but in a slightly different harmonic configuration. But you're correct that Revelation is designed around this principle. For example, in the opening section called Revealing the Tones, in the very opening section, everything occurs where it occurs only in the harmonic series, not in octave displacements. So you're hearing, and gradually I'm introducing higher notes in the series, right? So first I introduce 3 and 7, and then 9, and then a little later 21, and then eventually 63 and 64, where they occur in the harmonic series, so way up in the top notes of the piano. So then, right after that, those notes start being displaced by octaves lower in the mid-range of the piano. And then, so what's happening is your ear is very gradually adjusting not only to the new harmonies, but to the comma. And then by the time you get to the second section of the piece, which is called Revealing the Commas, actually, I think that's the third section of the piece, right? Because you have Night Vigil before that. Then in the third section, then that's the first time where you start hearing commas in adjacent tones in the mid-range of the piano. So right in the middle of the tone with the pedal down, you hear the commas pulsating and shimmering. But it's generally in very slow music, so you get to appreciate the pulsations. And then it gets faster. And then when you get to tone cloud 1, then you hear these incredibly resonant, almost like clusters of sound, although they're not exactly clusters, they're played with single notes and very fast permutations. But the commas are shimmering and pulsating all over the place. So it's a gradual process of unfolding of these commas. And then in the final section of the piece, which is called Tone Cloud 4, I am playing actually huge four-arm clusters. And you have actually that pentatonic scale that I was telling you about that's happening in the key of C with both versions of the commas. But then you also have commas between the C and an alternate version of the C, the F and an alternate version of the F, and a G and an alternate version of the G. So you have all these simultaneous commas happening at the same time.
Wow. That explains that section I heard then.
Yeah.
That's great.
And amazing, it doesn't sound so dissonant. It sounds, because it's based on a pentatonic scale.
Right.
So it sounds just really resonant, and you hear all these overtones and different kind of voices ringing out.
Yeah. Do you find that if you're working with 12 notes that are tuned to just intonation, that it makes things limiting for you in the scale? Just because, you always have all these situations where it's like, here's a note, it's a comma apart, here's another note, it's a comma apart, and then since they're so close, it's like the overall chromatic space seems like less saturated in the octave. You know what I mean? Is that ever a
Right.
problem for you, or something you have to work around, or?
Yes, and that's actually a really important point. If you're approaching working in just intonation from a similar point of view to how you were working in equal temperament, you're going to find just intonation extremely limiting.
Mm-hmm.
For example, with a traditional historical just intonation tuning, there are only 12 triadic harmonies that are in tune.
Right.
6 major chords and 6 minor chords. So you're only getting half of the harmonies you're used to. So then it's extremely limiting. What's happening is you're going to find harmonies that are either incomplete or have wolf tones. So then you're going to want to have more than 12 tones, right? Which is the history of music. I mean, and why temperament was invented.
Yeah.
And all those, different forms of temperament, and even keyboards that split black keys, etc. So if I'm writing that kind of music, then it does feel very limiting. But if I'm writing a different kind of music, it doesn't. For example, Revelation is a 7-limit tuning. There's no 5-limit notes in the tuning, right? So it's all based on fifths and septimal harmonies. And I don't miss the triadic harmonies at all because it's not designed that way. It's designed for something else. And there's still an infinite number of possibilities to work with. You just have to work with the pitches that you've chosen.
Right.
And we spoke at the very beginning a little bit about my piece, Just Constellations. So, for example, the whole opening section, which is 8 minutes long, stack only uses 5 pitches. And at least to me, I never get bored of those 5 pitches because they're very carefully selected, and I stack up different harmonic configurations of them, and just the resonance sounds so gorgeous that I don't feel like I'm missing something else. Or another example is an Indian raga. Most ragas have 5, 6, or 7 notes. Some have more. But a master Indian musician can unfold a raga over a course of an hour using only 5 different pitches. And because of the melodic and rhythmic combinations and permutations, the music doesn't get boring. It's continually reinventing itself and finding new approaches to those same notes.
Yeah.
The essence of raga is finding many different melodic and rhythmic combinations and permutations. I mean, the same thing applies to 12-tone music, right?
Yeah.
Composers have set a row and then explore many different combinations and permutations. So the same thing happens in Indian music with, phrase structure, melodic phrase structure. And a master musician can take a 5-note raga even before the tabla comes, what we call alap, which is the free section, rhythmically free section. And keep finding new phrases such that they're never actually repeating most of the phrases that they sang before.
Yeah. Would you say when you're tuning things in ragas for Indian classical music, I know those are generally tuned to just intonation, right? Are there any ragas
Yeah.
that sound much more microtonal than other ragas?
Not so much. A little bit. But the reason is most ragas are in 5-limit just intonation.
Right.
So when you're in 5-limit just intonation, it doesn't really sound microtonal. Of course, it's not the way the piano's tuned. The notes are a little higher, a little lower, but not wildly so, right?
Right.
So it doesn't really sound microtonal. That said, the 7th harmonic is used in some ragas, and so that is 33 cents below, or 31 cents below where it would be in equal temperament. So that does sound a little microtonal. And then also you will use shrudis, which is a term for microtone in Indian classical music. Really good musicians will use different versions of the same note. So they might make slight, ornamentation or swinging between 2 versions that come a part of the same note. So you do hear some microtonality. But what you get more of that sounds exotic in Indian classical music is the augmented seconds. A lot of the ragas have augmented seconds. It's a very common part of the music. And to the Western ear, that has that kind of exotic sound of Indian music. But not all ragas use that. I mean, there's some very simple ragas that just are based on the major pentatonic scale or the minor pentatonic scale. But there's many ragas that use these augmented seconds.
Yeah.
Speaking of Indian classical music, it's really interesting. People have different theories about how the 22 Shrutis are tuned. So traditionally, we say that there are 22 microtones or pitches in Indian classical music. These days, from what I'm hearing, almost all musicians are really using a few more than 12. You don't really hear 22 microtones. It's not 12-note equal temperament. It's a form of just intonation, mostly Pythagorean tuning, except for the major notes are tuned in pure thirds. So how do you tune them? So theoretically, sa, which is your do, right, your tonic note, and can be any note, there's only one version of sa.
Right.
And pa, which is the note so, or the fifth note of the scale, there's only one note pa, right? So you don't have flat and sharp versions of sa and pa.
Right.
So then re, which is the second note of the scale, you can have natural, flat, very flat, and very flat.
Oh, so 4 versions.
So 4 versions, right. Really, it's better to think of it as the natural note and 3 versions of the flat note. So when it's flat, it's called como. When it's very flat, it's called ati como. And very, very flat, it's ati como.
Oh, wow. That's so cool.
Right?
Yeah.
And you could easily see how you do that in just intonation, right? The natural second would be a 9-8 relationship. The normal flatted version would be 16-15. The next one would be the Pythagorean flatted, 256
Over
over
243?
243.
Yeah.
And then the last one would be the septimal, which would be 28 over 27.
Oh, that one.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So then you go up to the note. If we're in the key of C, you'd go up to the note E, which is called Ga. So you would have the natural Ga, which would be 5-4. And then you'd have 3 versions of the Ga, flat, very flat, and very, very flat, which would again be your 6-5, your just intonation minor third, 32-27, and 7-6, which would be your septimal minor third.
Yeah.
Okay, then you get to Ma, which is the 4th degree. Ma is the only version that's ever sharp. So Ma is either natural or sharp or very sharp or very, very sharp. Sharp is called Tiva. So it's Tivra Ma if it's sharp and Tivra Tum if it's very sharp. Pa, we already covered. G, you only have one version of it. Then Da, the 6th note of the scale, you're going to have the natural and then the 3 flat versions. The Ni, you'll have the natural and the 3 flat versions. So what happens is if you add all that up, it's 22 notes. So that's how you get the 22 Shrutis of Indian classical music.
Those are very unequal.
They're very unequal. They're not equal at all. Now, the question then becomes, well, what about when you need multiple versions of some of the natural notes? Right? Like some people would say, maybe you want to have a Pythagorean major third.
Right.
Sometimes some of the ragas, you do hear the major third sounding a little sharp. I don't know if it's ever so sharp that it's a Pythagorean. But so that would be a different theory. And so if you look on Wikipedia how they tune Indian classical music, that's one way that people would show it is closer to, 2 different versions of all the 12 notes so that you get something that's more closer to quarter tones. But you don't really hear that so much in the ragas. But there are certainly different versions of the note, the 7th note of the scale, the natural 7th, right? You certainly use 15-8 and then 243, 128, which is the Pythagorean raised leading tone. In fact, that's used much more often.
It's very informative, and I think brings a lot of clarity to the issue to like hear your take on this because I know that it's like it's hard to sort of glean what the real theory is from just looking online, and a lot of the information about it says, "Oh, ask someone who practices it for more information." So it's very nice
But the
to
thing,
hear it from someone who actually does it.
thank you. But the Indian musicians don't understand the just intonation ratios in general. They've developed incredible ears, but they don't. I haven't met any Indian musician that could explain the just intonation theory to me.
Right.
And I've never in my life had an Indian classical musician come to me and want to learn it. Honestly, a little surprising to me because it's such an important part of the music, but they take it more from a doing approach of just learning how to hear it rather than a theoretical approach of understanding the vibrations and the relationships between them.
So I guess it's definitely music theory in the sense that they already have a common practice, and then just intonation after the fact can explain what a theoretical tuning of the interval is. But you don't have to know that to really use the system of Indian solfege and the various
Exactly.
shades of an interval.
And they have their own theoretical ways of talking about it, like this 22 Shruti system, for example.
Is it difficult to think in Indian solfege after having been trained in Western solfege?
No, they actually reinforce each other because there are very similar systems and they're just different syllables. I actually do both. So for Western music, I use the Nadia Boulanger system that they teach at Juilliard, which is fixed do, right?
Right.
Do is always C. So
Yeah.
if you're singing in the key of D, the D wouldn't be called do, it would be called re.
Right.
And it makes much more sense that way because Western music always modulates. So, then if you're doing movable do, it's great for understanding the harmonic relationships, but it's not practical if you're going to actually do solfege on a whole piece of music. So I do fixed do for that. And then for Indian classical music, I do movable sa. Sa is the do of Indian music, and it's movable. It can always be any pitch based on, the range of your voice or of your instrument. And usually I use either C or D as my sa. But once I establish that as my saw, then everything changes in relationship to that. That's a fantastic system for learning and understanding harmonic relationships
Yeah.
and melodic relationships. With do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, you have nice vowels that you're singing that are kind of more vocal than singing numbers, right?
Right.
And sa, re, ga, ma, pa, da, ni, sa, the Indian system, which is called sargam, is even more so because all the sounds are ah sounds except for re and mi, which are the second and seventh degrees, which are the most dissonant notes either side of the tonic. So it actually kind of makes more sense as far as the phonetics of the sounds that you're singing. And so it's a really nice system.
Yeah, it's really cool how that's built in.
And you have more than that too. I mean, you have, if you think about it, the fourth and fifth degree are ma and pa,
Right.
which makes perfect sense. And you have that reflected in Western theory too, as being the dominant and the subdominant, or the dominant and the dominant below. So you can easily look at that as being like the yin yang of music, or the male female relationship. The subdominant is the inversion of the dominant.
Yeah.
So that's beautiful, and it's actually reflected in the names of the notes in Indian music. I don't know if that's by chance, but it's there.
So would you say that Indian classical music places a lot of importance on the dominant as uh, somewhere to go to in another chord or somewhere to go to in the melody generally?
Yes, of course. The fifth note of the scale is called the dominant note in Western music for a reason.
Right.
It's interesting that, I'm going to come to Indian music in a minute, but it's interesting that we don't call the tonic the dominant note.
Right.
We call the fifth degree the dominant note. Why is that? Well, if you imagine whether you have a drone or not and you're singing modal music, which note are you going to want to hang out on the most? The dominant note, the fifth note of the scale. Because if you're hanging out on the tonic note, there's not as much life energy to it, right? It's already resolved. Well, it's the dominant note. It's like really enticing to just hear it and its relationship to the tonic. So that's why I believe it's called the dominant. And of course, the same thing exists in Indian classical music, where the dominant note is so important to many ragas, but not all ragas. And I'll give you a couple examples. There are some ragas like Malkants, which is a midnight raga. It's a certain version of the minor pentatonic scale, but the fourth note of the scale is much more dominant. And there's no fifth note of the scale. So it doesn't have a dominant note. So that kind of inverts the relationship. Also, in every raga, you have what are called a vadi and samvadi. The vadi is considered that dominant or most important note, and it's not always the fifth note of the scale. It is frequently, but not always. And then you have the samvadi, which is the next most important note. And the vadi and samvadi are always about a fourth or fifth apart. So they form a kind of polar axis for the raga. And sometimes they're the tonic and dominant, but most often not. So then you're starting to get a kind of hierarchy of tones where you have your tonic and what we normally call the dominant note in the drone. And then you'll have the vadi and samvadi, which could be on the same or different pitches. If they're on different pitches, already you have a hierarchy of 4 different notes of your raga. Now the result is that you often have bitonal relationships, which make things harmonically and melodically really interesting. For example, if you take one of the most common Indian ragas, it's called Yaman. It's the typical raga for beginning study of Indian classical music. So if you think of Yaman, it's like the Lydian mode, so it's the natural scale with a sharp 4.
Okay.
But just that in itself is not so interesting, right?
Right.
So how do you actually structure Rag Yaman? Well, it's a minor pentatonic scale built over the 7th degree, the major 7th. So if you're in the key of C and you tonicize the note B, right? Meaning that you're ending and beginning phrases on that note more than you are on the tonic. All right, then build a minor pentatonic scale above that. So you'd have B, D, E, F sharp, A, and B again. So that's your basic mode. You have that pentatonic mode juxtaposed against the drone C and G.
Wow.
So it's a beautiful bitonal relationship. It creates a lot of dissonance and resolution and a lot of beautiful melodic patterns. The way you do that is simply in the ascending scale, you always skip over the first and fifth note of the scale. So the sa and pa for tonic and dominant. But descending, you use all 7 notes of the scale. And that sets up that bitonal relationship.
Right.
And again, it's interesting when we talk about theory, is I've never heard an Indian classical musician talk about bitonality. Right? It's not even a concept, as far as I know, in the music. But a theoretical concept. But of course, it exists. I mean, all the musicians are doing it and living with it every single day, but just haven't developed this idea that we have in the West with our theory that, we're having a relationship between 2 different tonal centers at the same time. So it's a cultural dichotomy, that culturally we're doing things differently, from a musical point of view, and also the way we talk about them, understand them, and view them in theoretical terms is also different.
Like, one thing that always strikes me about non-Western theory is the constraint on melodic behavior that's very specific. Like, you talk about how you skip 1 and 5 ascending, but use them descending. And, like, the only thing I can think of in Western music that's like that is the melodic minor scale. But it seems like those sorts of things are everywhere in, I guess, Makam as well as ragas.
Exactly. It's a whole different concept. It's like people, when they're first learning about Indian music, they don't understand, well, why would you skip certain notes in the raga?
Right.
Well, the reason is because that's what gives it its unique flavor. So you can have the same parent mode and have dozens of ragas with the same scale, but each one sounds different because there's a different set of melodic contours and hierarchies that happen between each different approach or each different raga. Mm-hmm. But you're right, the melodic minor scale is a unique occurrence in Western music where you have a different scale ascending, a different scale descending. Well, that kind of thing happens all the time in Indian ragas. Another nice parallel is to talk about, well, do we have ragas in Western music? Like there's no word that you can translate raga to, right? A raga is not a scale, a raga is not a mode, it's so much more to that. So is there any equivalent to what a raga would be in Western music? Well, the closest thing, it's not really exactly the same thing, but would be the blues, right? There are different blues scales, not just one, but the common blues scale, which is a minor pentatonic with the augmented fourth added in.
Right.
So C, E flat, F sharp, G, B flat. There are so many songs using that mode that are all the blues, but everyone is, taking a slightly different approach to it. So that's kind of like a raga, where you have a set of melodic archetypes that people in the culture know and relate to that form the basis of the music.
Ta nom dir dir ta di ya na re ta da ni a ta ta na nom ta nom dir dir ta di ya na re ta da ni a ta ta na nom ta nom dir dir ta di ya na re ta da ni a ta ta na nom ta na ni ta re ta re ta re ta da re ta da re de de la na dir de ta re da ni to ga ga da ma da pa ma re ga ga da ni re da ni da pa ma da pa ma re ga ga da ma da pa ma re ga ga da ni re da ni da pa ma da pa ma re ga ga da ni re ga ma da ni re da ni da pa ma da pa ma ga ma ga da ta nom dir dir ta de ya na re ta da re ta da ni ya ta da na nom ta nom dir dir ta de ya na re ta da re ta da ni ya ta da na nom ta na ni ta re ta re ta re ta da re ta da re de 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 la na dir dir ta re ta om ta na ni ta na ta da re ta re ta ni ta nom dir dir ta de ya na re ta da re ta da ni ya ta da na nom de de le de la na de de le de la na de de le de la na de de le de la ta di ya na re ta di ya na re di ka na na tum ka na di di na gram tum gid tak tak gram tum gid tak gin ta na gid tak gid gid tak ta ta no de de ta di ya na re ta da re ta da ni ya ta ta na no ta no
Dire ta di ya na re ta da re ta da ni ya ta ta na
ta no de de ta di ya na re ta da re ta da ni ya ta ta na no ta no ta re ta ga re ga ma pa ni sa sa ni da pa ma ga re sa.
I was listening to Just Constellations again, and it seems like, does the pitch material get more and more complex as you progress through the four movements? Like with more notes, that is.
I would say yes. I would say yes. So there are 4 constellations in the piece. Each one has its own set of pitches and its own tuning relationships. So in the score, there's a tuning chart that includes all the pitches of the piece. I think there's 14 pitches. I forget how many. And the first opening constellation has only 5 pitches. The second constellation has 7. The third one, I believe, also has 7, but they are slightly more complex. And then the fourth one, I think, only has 8 pitches. But that's the only one that has 11. Everything's 7 limit except for the fourth one that has 11. So it also goes up the harmonic series in that sense.
Okay,
You have the
yeah.
11th harmonic in the fourth one. Also, the first 3 are based on harmonic regions of LaMonte Young's well-tuned piano. So the opening constellation borrows from the harmonic configurations of the opening chord. The second one, the romantic constellation, borrows from the harmonic configuration of the romantic chord. And the third one, the magic constellation, actually takes the theme, but it's the main theme of the magic chord, and gives you 3 variations of that theme. So it actually uses melodic material from it. And I give LaMonte clear credit in my program notes, and I wanted to even make sure that LaMonte was getting credit, especially for the magic constellation. So I actually included the variations on the theme of the magic chord. That's what it's called, the theme of the magic chord, in the title of the piece. So yeah, that's really interesting that you heard that. It does exactly that.
Yeah.
And the relationships do get more complex. So for example, the opening section, you have 7 and 21. So it's 1, 3, 7, 9, and 21 are the 5 pitches that occur in different octave juxtapositions.
Yeah.
Then the romantic constellation is like a Dorian mode using Pythagorean tuning, but a 7 to 6 minor third and a 7 to 4 minor seventh.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. And then the magic constellation is more like an Aeolian mode that focuses a lot on the 28-27 interval, which you find between the 5th and 6th degree of the scale. And then the acoustic constellation, which is the last one, uses the so-called acoustic mode, which is from the 4th octave of the harmonic series. So the 4th octave of the harmonic series, you have, let's say, 8, which would be, the piece is not in the key of C, it's actually in the key of A. All right, I'll do this in the key of A. So in the key of A, 8 would be A, 9, the 9th harmonic would be B, 10th harmonic would be C sharp, the 11th harmonic would be D quarter sharp,
Yeah.
the 12th harmonic would be E, the 13th harmonic I skip. No, the 13th harmonic, instead of using the 13th harmonic, I use 27-16, which gives me
Oh,
a
Pythagorean.
Pythagorean F sharp.
Okay.
And then the 14th harmonic would give you the low G. So that's the scale that is used in the acoustic constellation. But it also has a natural D in there as well. That's how you get 8 pitches instead of 7.
I think that's what I was hearing as a kind of apparent chromaticism, because like in a lot of the movements, if you weren't paying attention, you might just think it was diatonic because of the small number of notes used. You've got like a small mode, and then in that last one, you've got situations where Ds and D half sharps are like, they're not clashing, but they're near each other in the music, so you're like, oh, there's
Exactly.
2 different versions of a note. So that's what I was hearing, and I was like, I wonder what's happening.
Right, exactly. Very good ears. So, right, it's mostly diatonic, but there are some chromatic elements in there. I had the idea for that piece for decades, because when I first started working with LaMonte around 1980, and he showed me these gorgeous chords, the opening chord, the romantic chord, and the magic chord. Of course, I experimented a lot with them on the piano, but I also got together with some of my friends and students and sang some of these chords with sustained tones, and they just sound amazing. So those harmonies were floating around in my mind for a long time, and I wanted to write a vocal piece with it. And when I got the commission from Roomful of Teeth, I actually wrote them 2 pieces, because first they wanted an Indian music piece because they they were learning Indian music on this one residency that I was involved with them. And so they wanted a piece of music to reflect what they were learning. So I wrote them an Indian music piece. But the piece I really wanted to write was the one with the septimal harmonies.
Yeah.
So I came back the next year and wrote another piece, and that's Just Constellations. And they premiered it at MASMOCA at the end of the residency. MASMOCA is this amazing contemporary art museum in Berkshires in eastern Massachusetts. And then Brad Wells, who's the director, right away he wanted to record it, but it took a while to raise the money. But in the process, he came up with the idea to record it in the Tank, because he heard about this place. It's called the Tank Center for the Sonic Arts, which is in rural Colorado in the middle of nowhere. And it's a huge water tank from the age of steam engines, when steam engines used to have to refill with water along their routes. And so now it's being used for making music, and you walk into this place and you can literally sing duets with yourself. Like you can sing a note, it sustains in the air, and you can sing another note. And
because the reverb is so long.
They say that the reverb is as long as 40 seconds with some frequencies. So my piece was the perfect piece to record in the Tank. And so they raised the money, and they flew the whole group and myself out there, and we spent a week out there, and they recorded my piece and also gave a live performance of it in the Tank. And then the album finally just came out a month ago. So I'm like just over the moon, and the quality of the recording is just unparalleled. I mean, it just sounds just incredible. And the singers also, Roomful of Teeth, they really nailed the Just Intonation, and they really gave, they really captured the spirit of what I was going for.
Yes. So that recording then on Bandcamp is the recording that was done in the tank then.
That's correct.
There's a place we have like that here in Indiana. The War Room in the Indiana State House has all of these monuments to past veterans, and the ceiling is very, very high. That was the first place that I went to that did a similar thing, and I remember just the magic of it. I think the choir that I was with, we sang like a Jewish folk song that was almost almost just had one melody, but there were a few little harmonic parts. But that was kind of cool because you could kind of hear the scale harmonizing with itself.
It really makes a difference when you're doing vocal music to be in a resonant space. Same thing with ragas. You're singing a raga, it sounds completely different if you're in a beautiful resonant acoustical space versus, just a living room that's carpeted and it's dead. In fact, when we were at the tank, I took advantage of being there to go up early every morning and sing ragas for 1 or 2 hours in the tank.
Ooh.
And it's just incredible. I mean, just to have access to a space like that. It's kind of nice when, we're kind of in a fringe musical genre, of microtonality and just intonation, when something kind of breaks through a little bit into the mainstream, and people can hear it and appreciate it without having to understand that or know that there's anything different in the pitch content.
I think that's one of the greatest advantages of Just Intonation is it just sounds so beautiful and a bit exotic that it's got that power to pull people in for, I think, maybe a lot of the reasons that we like microtonality as a compositional technique. We want something exotic, but maybe we want people to be able to latch onto it as well. Maybe not, depends on what you're doing.
And that's what's beautiful about a cappella vocal music is it's going to naturally be in just intonation, right? I mean, if you're a singer and you're singing without vibrato, you're not going to sing in temperament unless you're accompanied by a piano or a tempered instrument. I mean, the ear naturally hears the resonant harmonies of just intonation. And so most of the historical a cappella music is in just intonation, and that's one of the things that sounds so appealing to it, from Gregorian chant to madrigals, to all the high polyphony in the Renaissance, to barbershop music, to Roomful of Teeth. If you listen to Carolyn Shaw's Partita, maybe they weren't aware consciously in the beginning, they are now, but weren't aware that they were actually singing in just intonation. But you listen to most of that, and it's mostly just intonation because it's for the most part a cappella, and they're just locking in tune, and that's why it sounds so incredible.
Yeah.
Part of why it sounds so incredible. It's also, in the case of Carolyn Shaw's Partita, it's also an incredible musical work. At this point, has become a classic,
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess the singers were probably pretty comfortable with singing it, even with the Just Intonation. Did you have to use any guide tracks for them, and what notation were they reading from?
So the way we did this is I did a residency with them at Mass MoCA where I worked with them every day. And first I did explain all the theory around just intonation and the ratios. I mean, again, they were singing in just intonation anyway, but I don't think they were familiar with the theory behind it. And then we sang a bunch of different harmonies, including, I introduced them to septimal harmony. And we did that singing with the tambora and different drones that I set up so that they really locked into that. And then with the piece, I put the ratio and sense deviations from equal temperament above every note of the piece.
Oh, nice.
And when we first started rehearsing it, people, each of the singers had their iPhone with an electronic tuner on it and a headset with a microphone. So when they were singing, they could look and see how high or how low they were in relation to equal temperament. And that way they were able to sing by ear, but also have a visual reference. And after a few days rehearsing the piece like that, everyone felt comfortable enough with it that we let go of the electronic tuners, and just from that point on, we did everything by ear.
Oh wow, that's wonderful. It surprises me that Roomful of Teeth wouldn't have sung things in septimal harmony before, or maybe they had, but they just didn't really. They didn't really need that knowledge. Like I'm sure in Carolyn Shaw's Partita for Eight Voices, there's some parts where they lock that seventh in.
Yeah, right. It could be. I can't think of any exact spots, but I'm sure in all of the repertoire there are spots, even if the composers didn't specifically request that. Because if you're singing, with a drone and you want a really strong minor seventh, that's going to naturally gravitate towards the seventh harmonic. And they do Mongolian throat singing, all sorts of things. I mean, part of the thing about Roomful of Teeth is, they're masters of all these extended and world music techniques, because every summer at Mass MoCA, they do residencies and they bring in different mentors from different world music cultures. They teach them all these techniques, right? And so much of, and then they have composers that compose music using those techniques. So much of what they do is based on exploring extended vocal techniques from a variety of different sources. And in my case, I didn't want to do that. I felt like it would be enough. I wanted them to just really focus on the intonation. I thought it was going to be a novel enough approach for them to focus on intonation. So my piece really is different in the repertoire in that way, in that it doesn't use extended vocal techniques and it doesn't use world music vocal techniques, but it just focuses on the just intonation aspect. And like everything else they do, they were able to do it better than anyone in the world.
Yes, I think it's really important that vocalists be exposed to different musical techniques from non-European cultures, because I feel like when I went to school, I missed out on so many different kinds of ways to like manipulate the voice. Like Tibetan throat singing, sideways yodeling, overtone singing, etc., etc., etc. The list goes on and on.
Also, we want to remember about the substance of music itself.
Yes.
Like there's a lot of trends in music today, towards different types of timbral effects and colors and extended techniques. And at least I try to, in my music, write music that won't depend on that, and has a kind of musical substance in its foundation. I think that's just important for those of us that are teaching music to remind our students, because it's very easy for a student, to get all caught up on wanting to do the latest extended techniques and sound colors. And of course, all of that's available, which is fantastic, and it expands the musical vocabulary immensely over what was happening, for example, in the common practice period. But at the same time, it's very important to think about, structure and musical substance.
There's almost like extended technique guilt. Like, I wrote a piece in 2020 for the Academy, but there's no extended techniques in it. Oh, man, you really missed out there.
Right. That's true. A lot of grants and awards tend to go to music that explores, these types of things. That's one of the interesting things that's happening in today's world is, Western, just music in general, or classical music, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, all the boundaries have been broken down, so that, now, especially in this country, you hear young composers writing in a myriad of styles. I mean, everything from atonal music to pop music to electronic music to hip hop. I mean, it's just like all over the place, and everything goes. And that's actually a really exciting thing, that music, we've broken down a lot of the stylistic barriers of what we call music or classical music. I mean, I don't even know what classical music is hardly anymore.
Yeah, that's really hard to know. It is very, very exciting. I think I read a book that was talking about postmodernism, and it said that what we would continue to see in the 21st century is like a dissolution of style in general, as people adopted many more different styles. I feel like are there's not just a dissolution of style, but there's also more schools of thought than there ever have been. Um,
Yeah, exactly. And the nice thing is that the different institutions are starting to open up too. I mean, there was a period of time, like when I was first in school, where you were expected to write atonal music. It was really limiting, actually, really limiting. Fortunately, I was at the very end of that, but definitely the composers before of the generation before me, at many institutions could not write tonal music if that was something they wanted to, and it was, for someone like David Del Tredici, for example, it was really revolutionary and gutsy, to go back and write tonal music. But minimalism really changed that, and Lamont Young and Terry Riley and later Steve Reich and Philip Glass and John Adams all, really changed that. And so now at most institutions, people, can write music with tonal centers. Of course, there are some places where some teachers that still, want their students to write atonal music, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, if that's their specialty, students, who go there will want to learn that. But it's really nice that things are opening up. And, places like Manhattan School of Music, you can go to a composition recital and hear, 12-tone music and pop music on the same program. Pretty incredible.
yeah, heck yeah. Or 12-tone pop music. An important part of being a composition teacher is like helping a student find their voice. And there's so many like arbitrary borderlines we draw between music that might not have to be real. Like, I wouldn't have done this as like college me, but like 27-year-old me, if I was at a school that was writing atonality and that's what I had to do, I would write things that would sound tonal but were really atonal in a technicality,
Interesting.
I love ideas that conflict with each other about how we're supposed to perceive the music and how that can be destroyed if we're a little careful.
That's a really interesting idea. I never thought of that exactly in those terms. That gets into the realm of concept art. And, so many artists and musicians have done such really interesting things with that, including 433 by John Cage. I mean, that's like now the classic concept piece. It changed the way a whole culture thought about music. And Terry Riley's In C too. That changed the way we approach music. That was just, that's simple concept of how he created In C.
Yeah. Were you also taught by Terry Riley?
I was. So Terry and I are actually really close friends, and I consider him to be a mentor. We were both disciples of Pandit Pranath, who was our Indian music guru, and so in the process, we hung out a lot together. I went to India 8 times.
Wow.
Most of those times were with Terry. Terry used to always stay with me when he was coming to New York, so I spent a lot of time with him there, and I also spent a lot of time with him in Berkeley, California, with Pandit Pranath, and at Terry Riley's ranch in the Sierra Nevada, foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains in California. I studied with Terry. I only studied raga for the most part, so when Pranath wasn't available, I would take lessons with either Terry Riley or Lamont Young in Indian ragas. And after Pranath died, for 3 years, I studied intensively with Terry, Indian ragas. And at that point, I met Ustad Mashkur Ali Khan, who is the leading singer in the Karana Gharana, which is the family lineage that Pandit Pranath had studied with. So I am continuing my Indian music studies with Ustad Mashkur Ali Khan. But whenever I get the chance, I practice with Terry Riley, and sometimes we give Indian vocal concerts together. And we just basically, stay in touch as close friends. He was also my best man at my wedding. I was just really grateful that he flew out to New York with his wife, and he wrote a piece called Royal Wedding that he played on the pipe organ at our wedding. And later he wrote a version of it for the Kronos Quartet, which is on their album Cusp of Magic.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
I have to say that Terry is one of the most amazing human beings I've ever known. Not only did he revolutionize an art form, but he's like totally humble and modest. You know, I mean, he's one of the few artists I know who doesn't have like a really big ego that is crippling his world. You know, he's
Right.
just really genuine, really honest, really nice guy, and has spent his life exploring what he's interested in music, and it's really diverse. You know, I mean, he's a master of Indian classical music, obviously a master Western composer, and he's a pretty good jazz pianist too. And he's always doing what he wants. And I think of him, you know, I heard him perform recently on the Bang and a Ken Marathon. Of course, I've heard dozens, if not hundreds, of performances with Terry over the years. And I kind of thought about an interesting analogy. You know, I'm also a huge fan of Miles Davis. I think Miles Davis is one of the most important American musicians of the second half of the 20th century, along
Yes.
with Leonard Bernstein and LaMonte Young.
Yeah.
And there's a kind of, you can make a parallel between Miles Davis and Terry Riley in that they're always exploring what they're interested in the moment, and they're often reinventing themselves. And they're always like pushing the envelope forward, doing something new and exciting. And always kind of on the edge, you know, and Terry's also a master improviser. I mean, his performances, he's always, you know, working with improvisational structures in a similar way to how Miles Davis was. So I think that's a kind of interesting parallel that I've never heard anyone else point out.
Very, very much so. I'm just thinking about how important improvisation is in music. Not just what you've been, you know, pointing out with Terry Riley, but also like the jazz tradition and everything with that. You know, it's everywhere.
Totally. And if you think about it, you know, all the genres of music in America that developed, maybe not all, but the vast majority, you know, came through black musicians.
Yeah.
I mean, blues, jazz, gospel, funk, hip hop, rap. I mean, the list goes on and on. I mean, there's probably 20 more genres.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, black culture is almost synonymous with American music. It's hard to think of different genres of music that developed in this country that didn't have black musicians at the center as the key innovators. I mean, maybe minimalism, right? I mean, you think of the important minimalist composers, you know, they're basically white males, but they're influenced by world music culture, you know, that came from Africa and India that was, you know, merging with Western harmony and concepts in orchestration. So, you know, I mean, certainly, you know, Steve Reich was very influenced by and studied African music, and Philip Glass and Terry Riley and LaMonte Young were all very deeply influenced by Indian music. And improvisation is at the core of it, too.
It's almost like the improvisation gets weeded out of some of the music that you learn in school too. Like, you know, Bach improvising fugues, and it's improvisations everywhere.
Exactly. Also, group music making is more common, perhaps in other cultures.
Yeah.
It's like creative. I mean, obviously in rock bands, you know, you find the same thing. I mean, but I mean, in a sense, that concept developed up through the music of jazz and rhythm and blues. The idea of people getting together and jamming and exploring a creative music process together. I mean, that if you compare that on the opposite side, where you have a composer in semi-isolation, writing notes on a page, then is given to an orchestra of highly trained musicians in a very specific style, with a hierarchy of where they are in the orchestra, and the conductor as the director ultimately responsible. It's a completely different paradigm of how we live and approach and experience music. And I think it's very important, and it's obviously happening in our culture now, but I think it's important to be conscious of what we're doing when we make music. What paradigm are we entering into? Are there hierarchies involved? Is it a creative community that is exploring and making music together? or is it a hierarchical system? I'm not saying one system is better than the other, but it's really nice to be conscious of how we're doing it and explore different paradigms of making music. It's just going to broaden our experience.
Absolutely. Yeah, the more things we can explore, the more we enrich our collective knowledge. I think there's a general preference for songwriting or getting together and jamming or things that are under that domain, because then it's like, okay, you know some people and you can just get together, and it's not like, oh, I have to compete in a bureaucratic system so that people might play my music and then they probably won't like it anyway. So that's just the whole path.
It's true, and particularly today with the pandemic going on and Zoom culture, and we're having
Right.
this interview on Zoom,
Yeah.
and people are, last night Ashley Bathgate gave this beautiful concert of Michael Gordon's new huge cello, hour-long plus cello piece called House Music. And it was on Zoom. Like, she played the concert to an international audience from her bedroom.
Right.
Right? So I'm finding that people in general are really missing a sense of community and being together, but musicians especially, because we're so used to making music together, and now everyone's making music alone.
Yeah.
I directed a music program this summer called Creative Music Online, and we had people from different parts of the world. There were about 25 people involved, and totally different musical backgrounds. And we found that people were really starving for this sense of community. So we did things to really encourage that. We had all sorts of programs that encouraged making music together, online, improvising together, even performing. And in our final performance, which we're going to post soon on YouTube,
Ooh.
half of the people involved in the program, for their presentation in a performance, they chose to do online collaborations with the other musicians, which I thought was really great and kind of symbolic of the times.
There is one more thing I wanted to ask you about before we take off. I wanted to ask you about the harmonic piano.
It's pretty cool. So what the harmonic piano is it came out of this desire to have more than 12 notes per octave, right? Which is when you're working in any type of microtonality or just intonation, as we discussed earlier, is a natural desire because you feel limited by having only 12 notes. But rather than inventing or adopting a different keyboard configuration, which would have 24 notes, there's difficulties with that because as a pianist, we spend our whole life on this particular layout of 12 keys. So it gets to be kind of non-intuitive if you have a keyboard that has a different configuration. So I came up with the idea. The piano has 3 strings for every note from the tenor up to the top. That if you remove the middle string and then you shave down 1/3 off of the right side of the hammer, when you press the left pedal, the unichord pedal on the piano, it shifts the whole action over so that the hammer goes from striking 3 strings to striking 2 strings. And that's just a normal piano design, right? So if you shave off the right third of the hammer and you remove the middle string, then in the normal position, the hammer will only be striking the left string. And when you press the pedal, the hammer will move over and only strike the right string. Right? So that way you can have 2 different tunings in most of the piano. Now, when you get down into the bass, you can't do it that way. So that's what I did with the harmonic piano. In addition, what happens is let's say you're tuning, a common approach would be to tune the 2 different notes on the same key, some version of a comma apart. So what's going to happen is you're going to get some bleed where it's going to, through sympathetic resonance, it's going to cause the other note to vibrate.
Right.
So what I did is underneath the strings is a rail with little mutes that project up, felt mutes, so that when you're playing the left string, it's muting out the right string. And when you shift the pedal and the action moves to the right, there's a mechanism that pushes the rail to the left. So it mutes out the left string, so that you're avoiding this kind of unwanted sympathetic resonance.
Oh, that is neat.
Yeah. It also has pedals that lock in place. So if you're playing in one of the tuning with the pedal in the downward position, you can just press it down and move it to the left, so you don't have to keep your foot on the pedal. And actually, all 3 of the pedals have locking mechanisms because I use all 3 pedals all the time, and that way you don't have to keep your foot on the pedals if you want to keep them depressed. I mean, you could tune it however you want. You could tune one in equal temperament and one in just intonation. I usually use both tunings in different forms of just intonation. And my piece, From Ancient Worlds, I have a nice recording of that piece. That's my primary recording that's done on the harmonic piano, so you can hear how it sounds. It has a more delicate harp-like sound than a normal piano because it's playing on single strings.
Yes. Yeah, it definitely changes the sound a lot for sure.
Changes the timbre dramatically, in fact, yeah. And my piece, Revelation, is composed for traditional piano because I wanted to be able to perform it on a regular piano and not have to move the harmonic piano around, for one thing. And for 2, I viewed it as a concert piece that I wanted to be able to play acoustically, so I wanted the power of all 3 strings of the piano. So I did limit that piece to using 12 different notes, and the recording of that is on a Hamburg Steinway concert band.
And then you also wanted the bass notes too, right? Did you have to use
those?
those? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I still use the bass notes with the harmonic piano, but you just have to, you have to configure the tunings so that you have some common tones between both tunings that you tune in the bass, which is not hard to do because just intonation, generally, if you're working in just intonation, you're going to set up a hierarchy of certain keys that you want to be in. So those keys you're going to want to choose for the notes of the bass in the tuning of the harmonic piano.
Yeah. Great. Well, awesome. Thanks for talking to us about the harmonic piano. This has been Michael Harrison, Indian classical composer and just intonation composer extraordinaire.
But it's a pleasure, Stephen, to be on your podcast. And I've actually enjoyed listening to a number of your podcasts. It's really fantastic to have a show that goes so into depth into just intonation and microtonality and what we're calling Zen harmonic music. So thank you for the really great work that you're doing. I hope that more people can find out about it and listen to your programs. And, the time is going to come when microtonality is the mainstream, right? I mean, just intonation is the entire history of music up until like 300-400 years ago. And it's an infinite system where, every different whole number proportion gives you a different pitch. So it's not limited in any way. So it only makes sense that just intonation and microtonality will also play a major role in the future of music. And where equal temperament is the dominant music, that's probably going to be a limited window that we're starting to come to the end of.
Yes.
So what's important is that it gets into the education system, because most of the people teaching music are teaching equal temperament, and that's all they know. And so people have to find other resources than traditional universities and conservatories to learn just intonation and microtonality. And fortunately, those of us that are teaching, there are more and more of us every year as more and more people become interested in this. So it's really important, though, that it breaks through into the institutions so that people that are studying music can get it as a part of their curriculum rather than through their own personal interests and independent studies. And that's happening and just starting to happen, and will happen much more in the next 50 years than it's happened in the last 50 years. And your show, I think, plays a really important role in that regard.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I'm personally very excited to be watching this evolution into more cultural awareness, more awareness of different tuning systems. I think the two are kind of closely linked. Like, learning about common practice theory has been monolithic and exclusionary for so long, and now most of the students have figured it out and are tired of that kind of thing, and they want to be learning about as many different approaches as they can.
Exactly. And when I first started exploring just intonation and teaching it over 40 years ago, almost no one knew what it was.
Wow, really?
And even when the internet first came on, if you searched on the internet, you search the term just intonation, for at least 5 years, my site was, even though I didn't have that much on just intonation, was like the first place it would take you. And now, there's so many incredible resources for just intonation. And I recently gave a graduate seminar at Princeton for the composers. And, I asked, in first class, I asked people, well, how many of you are familiar or have worked in any way with just intonation? Like half the composers raised their hands. So it's like really changed. And that's exciting because, why not open, the doors to explore new realms of music that have been explored so rarely in the past?
Absolutely. Couldn't have put it better myself. All right, well, thank you so much for the conversation. Really appreciate everything.
Let me know when you post it and I'll check it out.
Absolutely. All right, thanks. See ya.
All right. Thanks a lot, Stephen. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. The piece you were just listening to was Just Constellations by Michael Harrison, performed by the vocal ensemble Roomful of Teeth. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. Currently, we're trying to get 60 patrons by December 2020 in order to continue this podcast. We've got 37 so far. I'm also working on arranging Easley Blackwood's 13-note etude for keyboard since we hit the 30 patron goal. So for every 10 patrons we get, I'm going to be arranging a different etude for keyboard, so that's very exciting. Your support is appreciated more than ever during this difficult time. Hope you enjoy every single episode of Now and Zen. Thank you so much to our Zen Harmonic patrons, as well as our Zen Harmonic gods, Adam Fries, Matthew Sheeran, Vincenzo Cicarella, Hector McGuffin, Christopher Bailey, Leland O. Weigel, Amy Coleman, Jill Weigel, Tina Harmon Carto, and the Brass Whisperer. Adios. See you next time.